All right, hi everyone. I am Tyler Johnson. I am an instructor here with Manhattan Prep. And today we're going to be talking about GRE 101. So just kind of an introductory session that covers what the GRE is, how it works, and broadly what sort of topics are included within the GRE. A little bit about me. I've been working in test prep since 2015, and I've been working for Manhattan Prep specifically since 2019. And I'm here because I actually enjoy the GRE and I like standardized tests. And I know that makes me a weirdo. Most people I work with do not like this kind of stuff. If you're a student watching this out there right now and this stuff stresses you out, that's normal. I'm the weird one here. But hopefully by the end of today's session, I can impart some of my enjoy and enthusiasm for this topic onto some of y'all out there. And what better way to begin than everyone's favorite thing, a math problem. So here is a math problem. And before you all begin, I want to announce this is a select all problem. So there are 6 answer choices on screen. At least one of them will be correct, but potentially all 6 are correct. But without further ado, I'm going to give you all about 3 minutes to try it out on your own, and then I'll come back and we'll discuss this one. So enjoy. All right, it's been about 3 minutes, so let's start taking a deeper dive into this one. And just looking at the language of this problem, anytime I'm picking up on concepts like divisibility or factors or multiples, the solution to something like that is often going to involve prime factorization. So this hint here about breaking 4 and 21 down further, what I want to consider there is what are the prime factors of 4 and 21? In other words, the prime factors are kind of the building blocks of any integer out there. So we break it down to those building blocks. That's going to reveal some information about some other elements involving those numbers. Specifically, if I want something divisible by both 4 and 21, well, then that number must have all of these values in its prime factorization. Whatever this number is, it must include a 2, a 2, a 3, and a 7. Furthermore, any combination of those factors multiplied together, that would also be a factor of n in this case. So when I look at my answer choices, I need to figure out which of those are divisible by 2, 2, 3, and 7. So I can expand each of those values into their own prime factors. And at that point, 4 of them are going to work. 8 will not work because I only have 2 2s available, and 8 is composed of 3 2s. And the same issue with 24. I don't have enough 2s. But a single 2, 12, 14, 42, I have enough prime factors to compose any of those other numbers, so those are all valid answers. Any questions on that so far? And again, I'd say the biggest thing for me for a problem like this is when you see phrases like divisible, factors, multiples, etc. The key there is going to be prime factors more often than not. So now that you've had a little taste of some of the fun that the GRE can offer, let's talk more about the GRE itself. What we're going to be doing for the rest of today is covering what is on the GRE and how it works. We'll also talk a bit more about how it is scored. And then we'll close out talking about my opinions on how to get the most out of your preparation. So a few basics here. From the time you take the GRE, your score remains valid for 5 years, so you have a bit of flexibility in terms of getting your applications out there. And within any 12-month period, you can take the GRE 5 times. But you have to wait at least 3 weeks, that is 21 days, between any 2 consecutive retakes of the GRE. And the registration fee is $220. Your quant and verbal scores are going to be on the scale of 130 to 170 apiece. So combined, that is a maximum of 340 points. You'll also be graded on a single essay, which is graded 0 to 6 in half-point increments. And a couple rules. Unlike the GMAT, you do get a calculator on the GRE quant sections, which can be nice. And unlike the GMAT, you can change any of your answers within the section that you are currently on. On GMAT, I believe the current restriction is you are allowed 3 changes and that's it. But on the GRE, you can revisit and change an answer at any point as long as that question is within your current section. And in terms of results, they become available immediately right after you finish the test. A little window is going to pop up. I'll tell you more about how that works in a little bit. And in terms of sending your scores out to schools, typically, if you send multiple scores, most schools are only interested in the highest score that you're sending. But that said, every department is a little bit different. So it's best to check in with any programs that you're planning on to apply and see some are only interested that they only want you to send a single score. Some will tell you to send every score that you've ever received. But yeah, it differs. So reach out and figure out what those departments actually want from you. But do note, you are not allowed to super score. To be more specific, super scoring would be, just imagine if I had a January version of the test and a February version of the test. I cannot combine my January quant with my February verbal. I would have to send the full report from each. And by the way, the reason you have to wait 21 days between a retake is so that no one can get an unfair advantage. If you took the test twice in a row, you might see some recycled questions in there or something like that. So those restrictions are there to make sure that no one's seeing any duplicate questions and getting a leg up on the competition that way. Also note, the GRE is built by this company ETS. So if you're looking to register or find out more about this test, ets.org is the place to go, not gre.com. And in terms of what your GRE is going to look like, the first section that anyone sees, that's always going to be an issue essay. So you'll be given 30 minutes and a prompt, and basically you'll pick a side and defend it, whether you're for, against, or maintaining a more neutral position on whatever that prompt is arguing. And that gets scored on a scale of 0 to 6 in half-point increments. The other elements of your score, there's going to be 2 graded verbal sections. The first section you see is what we call standard difficulty. It's basically a mix of easy, medium, and hard questions. And then depending on your performance, you're going to be put into a second verbal section that has adaptive difficulty, which is basically either an easier, a medium, or a harder second section. And that is scored from 130 to 170. Same thing on quant, also 130 to 170. It's also 2 sections. First is standard difficulty, second is adaptive. What's a little bit different here is the timing. Your first verbal section is 18 minutes, your second is 23, and your first quant is 21 minutes, and your second is 26. But it is the same number on your first section, right? 12 questions on each of those. Likewise, for the second section, it'll be 15 questions each. So if you were to average it out, it's about 90 seconds per question on verbal, and about 1:45 per question on quant. But I would encourage you, think of it less in terms of the average time you're spending per question and more about the range. Because my recommendation is 30 seconds is about as fast as you can answer an easy problem, something you're really familiar with. And the maximum you ever really want to spend on a single question is 3 minutes. If it gets to that point and you don't yet have an answer, I think you're best served by eliminating what you can, but then taking a guess and moving on, because you do not want to spend all of your time on a single question. You want to make sure you at least see every problem within the section that you're on. And as I mentioned, in terms of order, the essay is always the same for everybody, but the quant and verbal could appear, in one of 2 ways. You're either going to start with a verbal section or start with quant. From there, we've always seen it alternate. I don't think we've seen an exam yet that'll give you 2 verbals in a row followed by 2 quants, or vice versa. So essay is always first, and then you might get a verbal or you might get a quant, and then it will alternate until you're done. And I want to spend a little more time talking about the adaptive nature of the GRE. As mentioned, depending on your performance on that first graded section you see, your second one is basically going to toss you into one of 3 panels. If you don't do so great on your first section, it'll be an easier panel. If you do average, it'll be a medium panel. And if you do really well in that first section, you'll get a harder second section. And that's what you want, because depending on that outcome, your score is either going to get a floor or a ceiling on it. And the way you qualify for the highest scores is to qualify into that harder second section. So always try and get into the hardest second section that you can. If you're more familiar with the GMAT, it's worth noting the GMAT is also adaptive, although the GMAT adapts question to question. So it's kind of just taking one data point at a time and then showing you either, a harder question if you got it right, or an easier question if you got the previous one wrong. GRE is similar, but it's taking all 12 questions from your first section to make that determination. And we'll come back a little bit later in this lecture to focus in more on like the specific floors and ceilings and what the scoring looks like. For now, I also want to show you what your navigation tools are going to look like in the test. Because you have access to all 12 or all 15 questions within a section, you have these back and next buttons, right? You can freely navigate between any question within that section. Or if you want to make big jumps, you have this review and mark button at the top of your screen. If you hit review, it's going to open a window that looks something like this, and it basically shows you all 15 questions on the exam and whether you've answered it or not answered it. And should you want to jump to a question, you basically click on it, it'll highlight, and then you click go to question so you can jump around between multiple at a time. You also have access to the calculator on that navigation panel, but do note it's a pretty rudimentary calculator, so don't get too excited. It's got your 4 basic operations. You can add, subtract, multiply, divide, and then you also have a square root button. But there's no cube root, there's no advanced functions, there's no exponents. You could brute force an exponent. By that, I mean, if you wanted to know 8 to the 5th, you could manually type in 8 times 8 times 8 times 8 times 8 and get an answer that way. But if you wanted to know 8 to the 40th, that's not going to work. It takes too much time. And there's also a max limit on the display of 8 characters. So that means the biggest number you could ever have is 99 million. And also note, although you have a calculator, this is something you should only use, a couple times on a quant section. You shouldn't be reaching for it every single question. It's for those rare cases that you're multiplying big numbers or there's like a long decimal involved. Cases like that, totally okay to reach for a calculator, but don't treat it as a crutch. As we'll talk more about in this lecture, the problems on the quant section, I mean, the problems on any section of the GRE, they're designed to be solvable within about 2 minutes. So most of the stuff you see, it's not going to require a calculator, but there are a couple instances where it comes in handy. So don't become overly reliant upon it. The next thing I want to talk about is guessing strategy. Because, surprise, surprise, the more questions you get right, the better your score is going to be. But note that there is no guessing penalty. So you should never leave anything unanswered or incomplete. And the difference, by the way, on this overview of not answered versus incomplete, you'll see an incomplete on, for example, the verbal section. There's a question type called sentence equivalence, where the goal is to select 2 vocabulary words that could fit inside of a sentence. So you would get an incomplete if you've only marked 1. Likewise, you'd see something like that on quant if the instructions ever said, pick 2 of the following choices that do X, Y, Z. In any case, you don't want to leave anything like that. There is no guessing penalty, so you might as well leave something entered. Even if it's a numeric entry question where you're filling in the blank, put in a 0 or a 1 or any number you've got a good feeling about. And every question within a section is weighted the same. That is, if it's an easy question that takes you 30 seconds, or it's a really devilish question that takes you 3 minutes, a correct response on either would net you the same amount of points. So a strategy based upon that is you want to concentrate on all the easier achievable stuff first before you expend time on the more difficult, the more long shot type questions. So for example, if I hit question 3 and I can tell that one's going to be a doozy, I might mark it as something I want to return to later. But I would also put in a guess. Don't leave it unanswered. Just like pick one of A through E, enter that as an answer, and move on. And that's going to ensure that you're prioritizing all the materials that you're more comfortable with, the questions that you think you can get. So should you run out of time, or should you, just have to guess randomly on a few, it's on the ones that were long shots that you didn't have the best chance of getting. In terms of topics on this test, ETS divides the quant categories into four broad things. That is arithmetic, algebra, geometry, and data analysis. There's a bunch of subtopics there. I'll give you a minute to kind of read through all of those. But if you're interested in getting more details, there's a free document available on the internet called the ETS Math Review. So if you give that a Google, that's an official document from ETS that covers a bit of everything you see on this page right now. In terms of the verbal topics, it's broadly two things. It's reading comprehension and vocabulary. And within reading comprehension, you'll see two question types that we call content-based passages and argument-based passages. Content-based stuff is more academic in nature. It tends to be things like science passages or art history, liberal arts passages. Whereas argument-based passages, they're more like opinion pieces from a newspaper. Argument-based questions are often about strengthening or weakening a certain conclusion. So it's less academic and fact-based and more opinionated. And the two broad vocabulary question types you'll see are text completions, where there is a sentence and there's either one blank, two blank, or three blanks. And then you have to select words from banks that best go into those blanks. And there's also sentence equivalences, which would be pretty similar to a single blank text completion, except rather than pick one word, you have a bank of 6 options and you have to select 2 words that best complete the sentence and in a similar way. So 95% of the time, you're picking 2 synonyms when it comes to sentence equivalence questions. But I also want to say, though there's this broad distinction of reading comprehension to vocabulary, these two question types test each other as much as they test their own topic. That is, expect on a reading comprehension passage, there's going to be some pretty advanced vocabulary words. And within a vocabulary question, the sentence structure can be very involved. So you'll need some reading comprehension skills in order to digest it. So that's all to say, both these things are important, but the more you study, the more you improve at either of these categories. Not only does it help its own category, but you'll get some gains on the core or the opposite category as well. Okay, in terms of registration, since the pandemic, the GRE has been offered in a at-home online version. So a couple distinctions between the traditional test center route versus the at-home route I want to go over. If you take it at a test center, if you've never been to one of these places before, it's a big room. There's going to be cubicles. There's going to be other test takers in there as well. And not everyone's taking the GRE. There's other tests administered at these places. But, there's going to be a bit of noise. Like you might hear the occasional cough or sneeze. There's going to be some typing ambience and things like that. So if those are distractions for you, you might want to consider taking it at home instead. There's also going to be a live proctor walking around and supervising the room to make sure no test takers are like chatting with each other or disturbing one another. And you'll be given scratch paper, which is basically this like 6-page booklet of blue paper and a couple pencils. Should you ever run out of scratch paper, you raise your hand to get the proctor's attention and they can come bring you a new booklet. But versus the at-home version of the test, in-person test centers are a little harder to come by, those appointments. So I encourage you, if you're thinking about taking it at a test center, just look at what kind of appointments are available right now. And that'll give you a chance to kind of better gauge how things might look when you're actually ready to take the test in a few months' time, if this is the beginning of your studies. But yeah, look into that because sometimes I've seen cities get booked like 3-4 weeks in advance. So you want to know what appointment availability is like sooner rather than later so you can make some decisions based on that. If you take the test at home, the test is identical. It's the same software and everything. It's just you'll be running it on your own computer versus a test center computer. In order to do that, you have to give permissions to the software to record your webcam feed, your computer's microphone feed, as well as the digital desktop. So it's going to like record what's happening on your screen as well. There's also going to be an online proctor watching your webcam, looking for any suspicious activity. But for the most part, you don't actually see that online proctor. They'll just kind of introduce themselves over voice. And you might have multiple proctors throughout the exam. They tend to switch off like every hour or so. So there might be a couple people monitoring you. But really, you're only going to be interacting with that proctor should something go wrong. There's a chat box you can use. So if like the software freezes up, or, hopefully it won't, but should any issues arise, you can use that chat box to get your proctor's attention. At the center, they give you a scratch booklet and pencils. If you're taking it at home, you'll have to use an erasable surface. And I think the easiest solution there is a whiteboard and some dry erase markers. You can also buy something called a transparency sheet, which is like a thin piece of plastic that you can then slide a regular piece of paper into. But whatever it is, it must be something that you can erase completely because they'll have you show your whiteboard or whatever your writing implement is up to the screen between every section to prove that you aren't like stealing questions or writing things down, because ETS is very protective of their intellectual property and they want to make sure that no information from your test is ending up on the internet later. And versus a in-person appointment, taking it at home, there are so many more appointments available. It's a much smoother, easier process. I've signed up for at-home versions of the GRE like 48 hours in advance, so ample opportunity to get a good appointment there. Beyond that, if you're planning on taking it at home, I'd also say make sure that you've got a quiet, private space. If you live in an apartment next to a busy street and there's lots of loud noises and distractions, maybe it would be better for you to take it at a test center to eliminate some of those distractions. Likewise, if you have a lot of roommates or you live with young children, it might be better to take it in a test center. Provided, if you're really dead set on taking that home, just make sure that anyone else in the household knows that you are taking this test and the exact times you'll be taking it, because you are required to be the only person in that room. So if that door swings open and someone walks in, you could potentially have your test results canceled. So just make sure everyone knows in the house not to disturb you for a couple hours while you're completing the GRE. And no matter what version you take, it's the same rules. You can't take it more than 5 times within a 365-day period, and you have to wait at least 3 weeks between retakes. I also want to talk a bit about reporting your scores and how that works. I mentioned earlier, from the day you take your test, you have the ability to send that score out for 5 years from that date. And day of, as soon as your test is over, the first thing that's going to happen is a little box, a prompt box is going to appear on your screen. And that box will say, do you want to keep and see your scores, or do you want to cancel them? And 99% of the time, do not hit cancel. You should only use cancel if things went horribly wrong and you got like sick in the middle of the test or something awful like that. Otherwise, you always want to hit keep and see, because if you hit cancel, you won't actually know the results. And I think it's way better to hit keep and see and then decide from there. If you don't like what you see, you don't have to send that score out, but you might as well find out what the score is and then make that decision as to whether you'll be sending it or pocketing it and not showing anyone. Day of, your options for sending scores, you can either send out that score you just got, or you can send out every score you've ever received to 4 programs for free. So that's a special thing. Day of, while you still have that ETS software open, you get 4 free reports that you can send out to anyone. So even if you're only interested in like a couple programs right now, I'd encourage you make use of those 4. So maybe have a couple reach schools that you send that data to, because it's 4 free ones. You might as well use it. Beyond test day, you still have the ability to send scores, but they're going to charge you at that point. So it's $30 per report. You also have this additional option where you can select any. If it's the day of, you can only send out your most recent or every score. If it's after the test, then you have the ability to kind of pick and choose between any test you've taken in the past. You also have the ability to pay to reinstate a canceled score. But again, for most situations, it's not worth canceling, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. One thing I would recommend is take the GRE at least twice. For most people, that first take of the exam is going to be a little nervy and a little unfamiliar. And just kind of by virtue of being more familiar with the process, people score a little bit higher on that second take of the exam. And after your first take of the exam, or any take of the exam really, about 5 to 10 days later, you get access to something called the GRE Diagnostic Service, which is a report that gives you helpful information in terms of what were the topics of every question you saw, how much time did you spend on each question, did you get it right or wrong, was it a quantitative comparison or a multiple choice question? So all that information can help you plan for your retake. The last piece of this is most departments out there, they like to see a candidate take this test more than once because it shows a level of determination and grit that they like to see in their students. So yeah, that's my recommendation. Don't take it just once. Take it at least twice. Some people will take it 3 or 4 times, but try and take it multiple times. And I think I already mentioned this earlier, but just to be clear, there is no super scoring. You cannot combine a verbal score from an earlier test with a quant score from a most recent test. If you are sending out a score, it must be the full report of both quant and verbal and the essay. Any questions so far? Okay, the next thing I want to cover is taking a closer look at the adaptive nature of the test and how the GRE is scored. Because as I mentioned earlier, your first section, it's going to be a mix of difficulties for everyone. And then depending on your performance on those first 12 questions, you get put into either a harder, a medium, or an easier second section. And the thresholds for qualifying into those, these are kind of plus or minus 1 question, but it's usually either 8 or 9 correct will qualify you into the hardest second section. Or in the middle, around 5 to 7 correct gets you to the medium. And then if you get 4 or fewer, that'll stick you into the easier second section. But you always want to get into the hardest second section that you can because that determines the ceiling on your score. If you only make it into the easier second section, your verbal max score is going to be about a 155. Your quant max is about a 151. And these numbers below, these are the percentiles. So a 155 verbal is about the 65th percentile. A 151 quant is about the 33rd. And in order to make it into the golden land of the 160s on quant, if you only make it into that medium section, you're going to max out in the high 150s or low 160s. So it's really important on quant to try and make it into that hardest second section. On verbal, you could still come away with a decent score if you nail that second medium section, but it's going to be a lot easier to get a high score, again, if you make it into that hardest second section. That gives you some wiggle room to still miss a handful of questions and come out with a good score. And I did get a good question in the chat that I want to quickly cover, and that is how the essays get graded. And specifically, I mentioned, day of your exam, a little box pops up that says, do you want to keep and see your scores? That's technically only for your quant and verbal score. The essay gets graded by a human. technically a human and an algorithm, but that usually takes a week of time for your full official score to come with quant and verbal and the essay. So you don't see your essay until about a week after your test is done. Another thing I want to stress about the scoring algorithm here is compared to, a math test in high school or something, you don't have to get 90% of problems right to get an A, to get a good score. On the GRE, you can only get 8 out of 12, 9 out of 12, so like 66 to 75% of the questions right and still make it into that harder second section. And, ditto there, you can miss a solid number of questions on the harder section and still come away with an okay score. So recognize that it's okay to let some questions go. If you're on a hard one and it's been 3 minutes, the move to make there is to not dig in further and spend another 3 minutes until you get an answer. It's to say, hey, there's some hard stuff on this test. It's okay if I miss a few. So I'm just going to take my best guess and move on. What you don't want to do is leave any easy questions unseen. So make sure that you've seen every problem in a section. You've got an answer registered before you start spending extra time on any problem that's really, really hard. Okay, the next place we're going to go is I'm going to share a few thoughts on how to get the most out of your preparation and some thoughts on what I think are the best practices when it comes to review. So first, a few notes on timelines. There's kind of two broad timelines I see out of people. If you're able to commit to like 10, 15 hours of study per week, then I would say your primary study, or if you're taking a class somewhere, it's usually going to be about 2 to 3 months of time, just kind of solidifying the foundations there. Once that class ends, or you've worked your way through a few books or whatever, then you typically want to give yourself another 2, 3, 4 weeks just to kind of go back and review, maybe solidify some shaky areas. And then I would say you would take your first exam. But again, plan on taking it at least twice. So also budget in 3 weeks later, taking that second exam. The other timeline I see is for people who can't put aside 10 or 15 hours. They're really heavily committed with work and, other outside commitments. Or if you're expecting a very significant score increase, that's going to take more time. So what might happen in that case is your primary studies are going to be somewhere in the range of 3 to 5 months. And then you'll give yourself another month or two to kind of go back and revisit material and make sure that what you were learning has stuck. But then same thing at the end, budget 2 takes of that exam. So depending on which timeline you fall into, you might want to look at the upcoming deadlines in terms of round 1 or round 2 or whatever the deadline is for the programs you're interested in, and then kind of count backwards from there as to when you should start your studies. And broadly speaking, what you want to be paying attention to while you study is tracking this data somewhere so that you are concentrating on the material that you've missed. And you're not seeing the material you've missed just once. You are coming back and revisiting it at a later date to see if you've learned anything, to see if you've improved upon that stuff you were missing before. Another important aspect is spaced repetition. And I think for the vocabulary part of the verbal sections, this is the most important thing. So the way you expand your vocabulary, it's not by like reading a word's definition once and then hoping you remember that should it show up, 4 months later on your test. It's by making flashcards and reviewing those consistently. And a recommendation there for vocab specifically, you want to be using something called a Lightner box method, where if you have like a deck of cards, don't make it just one deck. I would say have 3 or 4 decks. There's one deck that you review every day. That's where all your new words start. And then you've got a deck, as you start to get some of those right, you've got a deck that you review every other day. And as you get some of those words right, you've got a deck that you review once a week. And as you get those right, you've got a deck that you review once every other week. But should you ever get a card's definition wrong, it all reverts back to that first deck and it goes into that pile you're reviewing every day. There's lots of learning science out there that is one of the most effective ways to learn, not just vocab, but a lot of things. So if that's a new concept to you, look it up and incorporate it, especially for vocab. There's also this idea that testing is the most effective studying. And by that, I don't necessarily mean taking a practice test every single day. I definitely don't recommend that. That's a quick recipe for burnout. It's more so that you need to approach your studying with this idea that you are testing yourself and that it's okay to get things wrong. And that, having something wrong, that's actually valuable information because that indicates, should you see this problem on a real test, you would drop those points. So before the real test comes, you need to iterate and drill upon this method further until you turn those lost points into something you now understand. That's how you improve at this test. You iterate and repeat what you're getting wrong until something clicks and you understand it. And then that guarantees, should that topic appear on the test, you are now gaining those points instead of losing them. Finally, don't forget to take care of yourself mentally and physically. Sometimes I have students who have this mindset of they're going to like clear out their social calendar for 3 months straight and have the GRE be the only thing they do. Do not do that. You need to be in a healthy and happy place mentally in order for your brain to be in a good position to learn new things. So make sure, by all means, it's okay to scale back some of the social activities, but don't eliminate them entirely. You need to continue to do what you can to be a happy person and take care of yourself physically as well. Exercise, getting enough sleep at night, eating healthy, those are all going to help your brain learn as well. And a few recommendations of some things I don't think you should be doing. So let's say you just did a practice set of problems. You should not only look at the ones you get wrong. There's often things you can gain by looking at questions that you got right. And should you get something wrong, don't read that explanation immediately, right? Don't jump immediately to the back of the book and try and do what the back of the book said immediately. There's a time and a place for that, but it's not right after you finish a problem. So ideally, if you do a practice set, the best things you can do to review are: one, budget to spend about double the time you spent doing that practice on review. So if you took a 2-hour practice test, you want to spend 4 hours going back through, reviewing and scrutinizing your performance. And as mentioned, it's not just about what you got wrong. You want to make sure you're reviewing what you got right to ensure that you got it right for the right reasons, that it wasn't just luck. And when things are wrong, it's not just acknowledging, yeah, it was wrong. It's diagnosing it, figuring out precisely where your approach went wrong, and then incorporating some new idea so that you won't repeat that mistake in the future. So that last bit, we often call that a takeaway. Finding some sort of actionable takeaway so that when you see similar triggers in the future, you're going to have a new, more informed response so you don't keep making the same mistakes. So to get into the specifics of a good review process, after I finish a problem set, the first thing I want to do is just kind of review globally. How was my confidence? How were things mentally? Did I feel shaky, or did it feel like I was making the right moves throughout? And it's very rare that you're going to do an entire problem wrong every step of the way. So diagnose like what about what you did is acceptable and something you would repeat next time versus where did you kind of get off the path? What would you modify next time? And also check in with your comprehension of the question. Sometimes, people, I see this a lot on math, that people understood what was happening, but they answered the wrong question in the end. Like the problem was asking you for X and you gave them the value for Y. So recognize when you understood the core concept versus sometimes you'll see a question and it totally throws you for a loop and you don't really know what the core of the problem was even about. So get clear on that distinction. And then look into your time investment as well. Did you rush and get something wrong that you could have potentially gotten right had you taken it a bit slower? Or did you maybe overinvest in a problem that you were lost from the beginning and maybe it was something you wished you had just bailed in the first 20 seconds so that you could have saved your time on some more gettable questions? If it's on quant, check out your scratch work. Is it kind of messy and all over the place? If so, do what you can to maybe think of it more like a grid or kind of like a spreadsheet or a table to make it sure to ensure that your scratch work is as digestible as possible. And a few more details about like right versus wrong questions. Obviously review what's wrong, but even if you get something right, check the official explanation and make sure that you got it right for the right reasons, that it wasn't just serendipity, and also be open to some alternative or potentially more efficient approaches. Because even if you're getting something right, maybe there's a better way that can, save you a minute, which on a time test like this, those minutes can be very precious. If you get something wrong, what I'd recommend is decide, is this problem worth learning? Right. And when I say that, the two big topics that come to mind are probability and combinatorics. I think pound for pound, those are the hardest topics on the GRE and they take the longest to master. But the good news is there's only going to be like 3 of those on your entire test. So you should save something like that for last. And if you're not there in your studies, that's okay. You may never get there. But learn to triage a question as being something like worth studying or something that, you can accept as just one of those hard problems that you might just want to bail on. If a problem you got wrong reminds you of something similar, I would say like go back and revisit that problem. If you've got any other previous takeaways related to what you're working on, refresh those concepts. But ultimately, you don't want to use the explanation at this point. The best thing to do right after getting it wrong is retry it before you look at the official explanation. Give it another go. And it can be like an open book experience. If it was a geometry question and you want to Google a formula, that's okay. But you want to make sure that you at least try it again yourself before checking out the official explanation. The reason that is, the metaphor I like to use, it's kind of like working out at the gym. The back of the book, that's your spotter. It's okay if it's there to kind of like back you up when you're in trouble, but you want your brain to be doing all the heavy lifting. So before you go to that spotter, try it again yourself, riff on it a few different ways. If at that point you're still stuck, that's when you want to check out the official explanation and, get that boost. The ultimate goal, though, with this review process, with these problems that you're going back through, is you need to be tracking all this data. And for that, I recommend something I call a review log. which at its simplest, it's basically a spreadsheet with 4 columns where you're going to have one, the source of the material, some way of returning to it at a later date. And then 2, a diagnosis, dive into it, decide what specifically went wrong. And then 3, you want that actionable takeaway. What new habit, what new way of thinking can you incorporate in the future to minimize a chance of that same mistake from recurring? And then finally, give yourself a date to reattempt it, a week or 2 weeks down the line. Because should you try it again in a couple weeks and you still get it wrong, that indicates you really haven't learned the core concept of that problem yet. So it's something that remains in your review log, and you keep iterating on it until you get it right. Once you got it right, that's what indicates that should this show up on the exam, you'd now be picking up those points. And as you're developing these takeaways, I'd encourage you to think about some of these questions. Like, what are the elements of the question that you'd expect to see in a similar looking problem? It's a matter of training yourself to recognize these elements so you know when to pull for that same response. And I like to think of it as this kind of like trigger response, like a stimulus and then an action you take in response to that. Another great thing when developing your takeaways is to put yourself in the shoes of the people that are writing these questions. Because on a multiple choice question, on a a multiple choice test, those trap answers exist for very specific reasons, right? Because they know certain people are going to commit certain mistakes. That's what makes a tempting trap answer. So learn to identify those traps. And once you're able to do that, you can kind of sidestep them and avoid them. And when it comes to math, there's certain things that are more fact or rule based than other areas. What comes to mind there is geometry. There's many formula and properties and rules that you have to learn. So some of that stuff is just a matter of memorization. But like flashcards or like vocabulary, you can use flashcards. You can incorporate spaced repetition for stuff like that. So don't just use flashcards on verbal. It can be pretty effective on quant as well. And then when you're creating these takeaways, try and make it in this actionable format of when I see X, I'm going to do Y. So X is going to be your stimulus. Y is going to be the new action that you take in response. And a couple notes on diagnosing yourself. Even when you get something right, ask yourself, could I be doing anything better? Is there a more efficient process here? And if you find yourself making a careless mistake, don't just say, oh, that was silly, I'll never do that again. Ask if there's a new habit that you can incorporate. I'll give you an example of a silly mistake I used to do until I started tracking all this stuff. One of these is a 5, one of these is an S. The way I used to write it, it was very difficult to tell the difference. What I do now is I make my 5s really big and I make my S's really small so I can tell just based on scale alone which one is which. So any silly mistakes that you do, it's worth sitting with it for a second to see if there's something new that you can do to prevent it. And these last 2 bits, I mentioned probability and combinatorics earlier, and it's the same kind of idea there, that if something's really rare, it may not be worth it to you quite yet. So is it worth studying? What do you want to prioritize? Before you spend significant hours on rare topics like probability, combinatorics, sequences, rare stuff like that, it's so much more important to be solid on something like geometry, for which there's going to be like 6, maybe 7 questions on the exam, or exponents, arithmetic, algebra, stuff like that occurs all over the place. So make sure you're solid on the foundations, the prevalent stuff, before you worry about the really niche categories that may only be on the test once or twice. Okay, a couple of other things to mention before we close out is we kind of have this idea of, your business or your GRE test mindset versus kind of like the old school, what we're taught in high school. There's a few things you want to change there, right? In high school, you want to try and study to get like 90%, 95, 100% of the questions right. Not the case on a test like this. You can miss, sometimes 20, 30% of the problems and still come away with a competitive score. So the sooner you accept that, the easier it's going to be to make smart test decisions and bail when a problem is too hard so that you can spend that time you would have spent on some easier questions. I also feel that, if you all had 8 hours to take this test, I could coach nearly anyone to a perfect score, but it's not the case. It's a time test. That aspect is definitely stressful. And you don't want to fight against that, right? You don't want to just say like, oh, I can get myself to a point where I'm just going to blaze through these problems and make everything easy. It's much easier just to accept that, yes, the timing is stressful. This is kind of a stressful experience, and that's okay. You can learn to mitigate some of that stress. I think one of the easiest things you can do is a deep breath in and out. There is science behind this that a deep breath in and out basically massages your vagus nerve that runs down your brainstem, down your spinal column. And it's that nerve that has a large role in your fight or flight response. So deep breath is just going to kind of like tingle and massage that nerve and release some natural stress relieving hormones or enzymes. I'm not a scientist. Don't ask me which one it is. But again, there's plenty of research out there showing the benefits of a deep breath. Um, in regards to bailing, the worst way to get a problem wrong is to start a problem and be like, oh, this one's a doozy. It's going to be tough, and then overcommit and spend 3, 4 minutes on it and get it wrong. The best way to get something wrong is to read it and say like, hey, this one's really tough. It's been 30 seconds. I should only invest time in something like this after I've seen everything else. So within that 30 seconds, you put in your best guess, you move on to something else. Hey, you got it wrong both times, but on one, you gave yourself like an extra 2.5 minutes that you could spend elsewhere, ideally on some easier, more achievable questions. And this last point, to me, this is specifically a point about quant, in that the GRE is not a math test. It is a quantitative reasoning test. As such, it really rewards those who are able to approach math questions from kind of a more creative process, right? You don't get any bonus points for solving things in the crunchy algebraic way, the way your 10th grade math teacher would have wanted you to. So anytime you can spot an opportunity to cut some corners and use some estimation, or perhaps plug in some of your own numbers as a substitute for some variables, any of those creative, more like right-brained approaches, those are often going to get you a solution faster. So I encourage you, get out of this thinking of it's being a math test and recognize it's a quantitative reasoning test, and alternative approaches are rewarded. Okay, that's basically everything I wanted to cover. Before we wrap up, I want to take any open questions from people in the audience right now. And I think I've got one in the chat already. There's a question about essay length. It's a great question. And I would say the best advice I can give you there is that you should shoot for 350 words minimum. And there's no word counter within the essay software. It's very bare bones. It's basically a box that you can type into. There's no spell check or grammar check or anything like that. But 350, like that's the least that you should ever shoot for. And like even better would be 400 plus, 450. If you can get to 500, awesome. But yeah, the more you can write, provided as long as you aren't just repeating yourself over and over, the more you can write, the better. And in terms of format for the essay, I'd recommend usually like your 5-paragraph academic style. So have an intro and then a couple body paragraphs. And then your outro. I had a question in the chat. Will you have access to this recording? Yes, I think within a week or two, this will be uploaded onto YouTube. So it won't be available immediately, but yeah, this will be up publicly on YouTube in a couple weeks. Any other questions? Cool. Well, if you enjoyed this talk, you all can sign up for a free GRE starter kit by visiting manhattanprep.com. And if you're interested in checking out any of our courses, there is a discount code available on screen right now. So be sure to check that out as well. We also open session 1 of our 9-week GRE course up to the public. So if you're on the fence about taking a course, you can come check out the first 3 hours of the course at session 1. Try out a few instructors, see who vibes with you the most. You're welcome to do that. But yeah, all that information is available online at manhattanprep.com. Other than that, I will say it was fun hanging out with y'all this past hour. Yeah, so enjoy your studies. I wish you the best of luck, and I hope to see you at a class in the future.